Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today with two very special guests, Ajay Agarwal and Kevin Zhang, both of Bain Capital Ventures. Ajay, Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Erik. Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So why don't we zoom out by way of introduction? Ajay, why don't we start with you? Where is your investment focus today at BCV, and how has that evolved over time? And then we'll get to you, Kevin.
Yeah, I've been at Bain now 17 years, and I would say the part that's been constant is I invest primarily in software companies, and I invest primarily at seed and Series A. And that's really been true both for the 15 years prior to Bain when I've been in startups and working on companies. It's primarily been early stage software companies. And it's true certainly for the last 17 years at Bain. And, I think one of the themes we'll talk about is just how software has changed. And, clearly the world moved from, when I grew up in software, the on-prem world and client server and all of those trends in the 90s that fueled kind of the first wave of enterprise software. And, this last 20 years has been about the cloud. But I think there have been some other, interesting changes as well. And we'll talk about how the nature of distribution of software companies has dramatically changed, the rise of, bottoms-up software. The company I was with, Trilogy Software, we were a classic top-down, big deal, sell the dream to, a C-level executive and try and walk out the door with $5 or $10 million. And that was a great model. Particularly, it was a great model when you got all the money up front. I mean, that was the beauty of, those top-down perpetual license deals. But in the world of SaaS, where you don't get your money up front, you get your money over time, it makes that top-down 2-year sales cycle that much harder, because at the end of that 2 years, you're going to get some money, but it's going to take you 10 more years to get all the money that you would have gotten in the prior era. And I think that combined with the fact that the cloud makes software so much easier to consume has led to this explosion in bottoms-up software. So Kevin and I will talk more about that as we go along, but that's the way to think about my investment focus. Two other sub-themes are supply chain and industrial automation. So, had the benefit early in my career to invest in Kiva Systems, one of the pioneers in the world of robotics, warehouse automation. So that has been, an area that continues to be of interest. And we've made a number of recent investments in that arena that we'll talk about. And then, I think the third area that we'll chat a little bit about is just thinking about powering the rest of the economy. As we think about beyond information workers and all the software and tools being built here in Silicon Valley for information workers, what about the software and solutions needed for the rest of the economy? And we'll share some thoughts there as well.
Totally. Kevin, how do you think about scoping your investment focus? And then we'll get into some of these ideas.
Yeah, totally. Ajay and I work very closely. I think the reality is there is a lot of business software to cover between two partners, westward to San Francisco and eastward to New York. And so I think we spent a lot of time working together on sort of our market opportunities. I think when I think about some of the daylight kind of between where Ajay focuses and where I spend some of my time, I think probably some of the themes would be incorporation of financial technology into business software, which is a trend we're seeing. Happy to chat more about that. And my personal background is in fintech, and so it's certainly lending is a space that I've spent a lot of time in, and with both customers and the technology providers. I think that another is sort of the future of work. I've, in addition to a lot of our business software investments, I've been involved in our investments in Wonolo and Lime, both of whom kind of touch on contract labor, how work is changing for blue collar roles that aren't tied to a desk. And that's probably another area that I spend some time thinking about. Yeah.
So Ajay, let's get into how the space has evolved in terms of what types of bets you've made or been interested in making, and what that means going forward.
Absolutely. And Kevin, jump in here, because this is really a tag team in terms of the two of us spend a lot of this time together. But what's interesting, and I think at Bain Capital Ventures, our first exposure to this notion of bottoms up, high velocity software, was really about more than 15 years ago, a company called SolarWinds. And it was a company that, my partner Ben Nye led for us. And, it was a company that was selling network management software. And network management software is, you think of as the classic top-down HP salesperson, computer associates selling to the CIO. And this company in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with literally no salespeople, had tens of millions of ARR selling this network management software. And the way they built it was through this community. They had this community website where if you were a network administrator inside a large company, this is the place you went to get tips and content about managing your network. And they had a piece of software that you could swipe your credit card for under $1,000 and start using it. They literally had no salespeople. They had this uptake, and they had hundreds and hundreds of large companies where 1 or 2 or 3 network managers were using the software. And so when we found this company, we were astonished that a software like this, and again, remember, this is now 15 years ago, could be sold in this bottoms-up manner. And through our networking context, we called up the CIO of Staples, and we said, "Have you heard of SolarWinds?" And he said, "I've not heard of it." And we said, "Did you know that a dozen of your network managers use the software to manage Staples network?" And he had absolutely flabbergasted. He said, "That cannot be true. There's no chance." And I think SolarWinds went on to be a public company worth $6 billion, and I think in many ways was one of the early pioneers in this world of bottoms up. And yes, eventually you may need to layer on an enterprise motion where salespeople are going out and talking to the C-suite. But when they're going out and talking to the C-suite, they can say, "You're already using our software. It's already being used. Now we can sell you access control and security and an enterprise license agreement and all the things you CIO or CEO or CMO care about, but we don't have to convince you to start using the software." And so I think we've seen a series of companies throughout our portfolio, SolarWinds, LinkedIn, SurveyMonkey, that were all built on this kind of model. But I think what's happened is it's really reached a tipping point. And just like there was this tipping point with, on-prem and client server to cloud, you're now seeing this tipping point with bottoms up companies. And that I think has really interesting implications, not only for the startups we are funding, the actual software companies that we're funding, but also the infrastructure and the set of tools those companies need, and as well as the buyers of software need in order to manage this new world order that we're in. And so I think that's what's exciting for us, that there are a whole set of ecosystem opportunities that we see with this sea change and how software is bought and sold. It also means the kind of expertise that we as a venture firm need to be able to offer founders is very different, than the expertise of, how do you sell a big deal, which I think still exists, is still valuable. And we have plenty of companies that value that and take advantage of that. But there's this new skill set that also needs to be built and a set of value add that we have to be able to deliver to our founders. So
yeah, and I think certainly we have the benefit at Bain of having worked with some phenomenal bottom up companies over the past 15 years. Ajay, having been there 15 years, knows better than I. DocuSign and SendGrid and SurveyMonkey and Reich and other names. And I think part of the perspective that I bring to it is, having worked at a young startup in the last 5 or 10 years, and been part of I was at a Khosla-backed fintech company called Fundera. And, I remember sort of we were 12, 15, 20 people in sort of the back corner of some office we subleased in Midtown Manhattan. And it was interesting because it just wasn't an environment where, we were being force-fed software. It was an environment where we were all trying to be productive and we're each finding tools that made the most sense for us. And, every once in a while we would have to buy the industry standard, CIO approved software in sales and marketing or CRM. And we would unpack these things and set them up in a long, arduous process. And then, I just think a lot of us were just incredulous, having used easy to use consumer grade stuff like a MailChimp or, for email or Wufoo for forms, and then have to go to some of this software and we're like, why do we have to click so much? And why are there so many menus? And why are things so hard to find, hard to learn? And I think that that perspective seems to permeate the industry. Now people are designing tools that are really user led. I think the user now has more power than ever in making these decisions. And I think users are increasingly, falling in love, not falling in line when it comes to technology. I think that is just an exciting opportunity. One lens we also put on this is, I think some of the recent data has come out around, seed investing shifting from consumer majority to enterprise majority. I think one of the interesting ways to think about this is that enterprise is becoming more consumer. That consumers are adopting business level tools like Superhuman, and businesses are adopting consumer level tools like Dropbox. I think that creates a whole new paradigm how to build these.
Yeah, companies. And I think it's as Kevin mentions, sort of the power of the individual user now dictating the software they want to use. It reminds me, the early days when I was at Trilogy, I was employee number 18, and I remember the founder, who's a brilliant entrepreneur, Joe, said, customer success doesn't matter. And I said, what are you talking about? Like, that goes against everything you learn in your whole life about business, that you want to delight your customers. He said, how many customers like SAP? And he said, none, zero. They all hate SAP, yet it's at the time, the most valuable software company on the planet. And so he said, it doesn't matter. And what matters is, how good are we at selling the software? And, the software we had was good. It wasn't like it was bad software, but the reality is it didn't really matter. And we were at Bain early investors in Gainsight. And, part of the reason we invested in Gainsight when they had a few $100K of revenue was this idea that, both the combination of moving to a SaaS model where you basically have to re-earn your payday essentially every month or every quarter, every year. And if the customer doesn't like it, they can terminate the contract. But also this dynamic that Kevin mentioned, which is software's permeated the life of most individuals on the planet. So whether you're in technology or not, you're probably ordering stuff online. You're probably ordering an Uber or a Lyft. In some portion of your daily life or yearly life. And so you're getting exposed in a way that wasn't true, 20 years ago. And so then you come into work and you wonder what's going on here. We have this great company in transportation called Forkites where, the simple way to express their value proposition is they help companies like Kraft and British Petroleum know where their trucks are and know if their truck is getting to their customer on time. And the way the founder, Matt, describes it is we all know when our package is coming from Amazon. And then you go to work and you're like, we have no idea where our truck is. And Walmart's calling and they want to know where it is. And why can't this be just as easy? So I think this confluence of SaaS and cloud plus the fact that users are now becoming much more familiar with technology and what great software can be, I think that has led to this wave that's happening in a more meaningful way. Again, SolarWinds and SurveyMonkey and LinkedIn were from the last era, and they were the pioneers, but it's now become mainstream.
Yeah. And what's the most precise reason for why the pivot to SaaS happened when it happened? It didn't happen way sooner.
Well, I think the biggest reason from a technology standpoint was the fact that cloud made it possible to distribute software and distribute, more importantly, updates in a way that did not require someone to show up on site. Yeah. And so the challenge in the on-prem world is you had to send someone on site, in order to update the software. I mean, you think about a migration in our world at Trilogy or Oracle or SAP, that was a process and a real effort to make that happen. And so I think that combined with the fact that for new entrants in established categories, it was the only way you could disrupt the existing stack. So if I'm Salesforce.com and I want to disrupt Siebel, which is the incumbent, and people have invested, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars in this infrastructure, me showing up and saying, we have a better product, switch, and that $100 million you spent, you basically have to, throw it away, and you have to spend that same amount with me. And instead, what his pitch was, you spent $100 million on Siebel. You're now spending a couple $1 million a year just to maintain it. The 20% that you pay in maintenance and services, you're paying to Siebel. So just take that $2 million a year and give that to us, right? And give that to us on an annual basis. So in fact, it's no incremental cost to you. And over time, you can completely sunset that complicated system and you can move on to our system. So it was in some ways a financial innovation that allowed those new entrants, in the early 2000s, the first cloud companies, to really disrupt the incumbents. Now, I think the downstream implication has been that once these companies get public, financially, it's a way better model. Yeah. The scariest thing, I ran go-to-market at Trilogy, and the scariest thing is each year we started at zero. Mm-hmm. So we got our peak year is $300 million in revenue. Imagine we started that year at zero, mm-hmm. And you compare that to a SaaS company that's doing $300 million in revenue. They probably started the year at 240 or 250, and so it's a fundamentally different model. And then you layer on companies like SendGrid and DocuSign, where their net dollar retention is north of 100%, in SendGrid's case, 117, 118%. So not only do you start at 100%, you actually start at 118%, because those existing customers are going to grow with really no effort on the part of the company. So you could literally at SendGrid walk into the year, fire the whole company, and revenues would grow 18%. Wow. So I think a bunch of reasons really fed this wave and drove both, certainly cloud was a technology wave, but the business wave of SaaS.
Right. But similar with technology wave for a second, why wasn't that 10 years before? Like what really enabled that, just to zoom out even higher?
I was in a car on the way to the airport in a snowstorm. You were there for this board meeting, Ajay, with someone who was early at free markets in Kiva. And one of the things he was telling me, and I always love hearing stories about, the first .com era, because I feel like there are many lessons to be learned. One of the things he described ASP as an early entrant as sort of analogous to SaaS. Do you think there are any lessons from that, or can you describe a little bit more about your lessons learned on that?
Well, I think that starting with the technology piece, I think clearly a huge part of the shift has been, the ubiquity and the cost reduction of bandwidth and compute, and so if you think about the bandwidth that existed in the 90s, the notion of doing a software update remotely was just impossible. Just the sheer bandwidth cost associated with that made it, impossible. And so I think that certainly those two dynamics, I think, drove, a huge part of, that change. And I think the other piece was that, I think ASP is a good example of this, that typically the first examples when you have a new technology wave are essentially, the old model applied to the new technology. It's a little bit, our partner Matt, who's got a great discussion around, the world of embedded fintech, says it's a little bit like radio on TV. The early TV shows were essentially radio programs, except you saw the person reading, the radio script. And, the early .coms were essentially magazines that were now online, and so take the old analog format and just port it over. And ASPs were like that. They basically was, let's take this traditional on-prem software and let's host it. But the software itself was not architected for the cloud. And so as you think about concepts that, that we now take as, granted, like multi-tenant architecture, microservices architecture, the things that allow multiple companies to consume the same code base, the things that allow updates to be delivered on a daily, weekly basis, those things just weren't there architecturally as you think about, that world of the ASP. And so it was a classic case of right technology, wrong implementation. Let's just take an on-prem piece of software, let's stick it on a server, and let's stick that server in the cloud. You aren't getting any of the transformational benefits. It's only the next wave where you really see the transformational benefits.
So how do you subdivide the world today if you were to make sort of a market map or the different areas within sort of SaaS or enterprise that you invest in or look into? How do you make sense of the landscape?
I think it's an interesting question. I mean, there's a number of frameworks that we've used over time to think about it. I mean, certainly one way to think about it is in the world where a C-level executive had to be the budget sponsor, then you would just look at each C-level executive and what they're buying. CMO was a very popular topic. Perhaps 5 years,
maybe 10 years ago.
10 years ago, time frame. That'd be one way to think about it. So you can subdivide the world by sort of like, CMO, COO, CFO, software, and there's sort of big, billion-dollar companies built in each of those categories. Another way we think about it today is we think about this explosion in productivity software is is that I think Microsoft Office has done a pretty good job of enumerating the types of productivity there are. So there is Word for word processing. You have tools like a Notion or Google Docs that might roll up into that category. You have tools like PowerPoint where Pitch might roll up into that. You have Excel where there's sort of an explosion of products like Airtable or Dash or all these players who are doing different aspects of what Excel does today. I mean, you can certainly imagine a world where there is a SaaS provider for every tab of Excel, or even every button in Excel. That would be another way we think about it. But there's a number of frameworks to subdivide the world.
I think it actually, interestingly enough, lines up with this discussion we've been having about top down and bottoms up. Because I think in the tops down world, a very simple way to think about things was by business function. Let's create software that solves problems in finance. Let's create software that solves problems in sales and sales enablement. Let's create software that helps HR or the developer or DevOps or IT. And that was, you think about all the maps and the crazy Lumascapes and the MarTech maps and everything else. There were typically these functional views. And because that's how software was sold. And what's interesting is, take a great category. We're fortunate to back one of the winners, a company called Reich, which is, now a 9-figure ARR company, leader in their space. There is no functional owner for project management. And as such, it historically in the top down world was a crappy category. There were no big companies creating project management, circa 1999, because there's no function of project management. It's something that's consumed by, people across the organization. So I think the mindset shift that's taken place is now thinking more about types of users. So let me think about information workers. Let me think about gig workers. Let me think about, business analysts that are technical. Let me think about business analysts that don't know SQL. And so it's really more about, user communities in many ways and thinking about what is their daily workflow. Where are they having to do things that are manual or difficult, that can be automated? How are they using rudimentary tools like spreadsheets, to handle tasks that are better served in, dedicated application software? And so I think that's led to this explosion of companies. And Reich's a good example of it, where it's used by, information workers across marketing and project management and services and developers to manage, an array of projects. And it's created this large company. And so I think that's an interesting change that's occurred, where I would say a decade ago, it was a very functional view. And now we take much more of a community and user framework view when we think about spaces that we think are underserved.
Totally. But let's talk about some of the direct impacts that are emerging from how business software is changing. You mentioned in terms of what you look for in founders around more expertise in certain areas. Maybe let's talk about how that changes hiring priorities in an organization, and then we get into metrics.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the world of top down, it was typically a founding team had some combination of technology capabilities as well as a co-founder that was very outbound oriented, and selling the story was as much as important as building the software. I think that as we think about this bottoms up world, the founders that we're backing tend to, bias a little more technical, definitely very product oriented. And I would say that they're all across the board very compelling talents and individuals. But I would say if you had to rate them purely on their outbound selling skills, you'd get a pretty broad range of capabilities and some incredibly talented, incredibly successful founders of big companies who, under the screen of the old world of top down, would not be folks that would ordinarily get the kind of frothy fundraisers that you're seeing today. And so I think that's been a big shift, because by definition, you don't necessarily need to, or you also in some ways don't want to rely on the crutch of having someone who's a compelling salesperson be part of the founding team, because that can oftentimes lead to early metrics of success that may not be scalable or repeatable. I think the other thing it's done is it also makes us a little bit more flexible on where the founding team is located, or even if they're all located in the same place. And so as you think about these trends of companies being started all over the planet, companies being, distributed or remote. I would say when I entered the venture business, you would, the likelihood we'd fund something, based in Europe or in Asia or in Australia, the likelihood we'd fund something where the team wasn't all together, it was pretty much zero, back then. And now it feels very much the norm. And so I think those are some of the things that we've seen that have changed as we think about the types of founders we're backing, the things we look for in startups.
I think, and the one piece I tack onto that, which I think is kind of interesting, is also that you're seeing more founders without the 30 years of industry experience, where, having a deep set of relationships with C-level executives across the industry is less necessary in a world where you can sell to the user who may be a few levels below those contacts. Yes. I think when it comes to hiring, I think some interesting trends we see are, one, in how people prioritize their hires. I think to Ajay's point, for a more traditional SaaS company, you've probably seen a more even mix of engineering and sales early on. By sales, generally like a very outbound sort of, C-level targeted sales role. Whereas I think with bottom-up companies, we often find the first 15 hires, maybe 80% engineering, maybe, and tends to be relatively product and front-end oriented engineering in some ways that are really focused on the user experience. I think we're also seeing a slightly different emphasis in terms of, skill sets and titles. A lot of these companies have a different go-to-market model that isn't outbound oriented. They have a community oriented model, for example. So they might have developer outreach, or they might have a community building person around their target user base or user community. The product management is a little bit less, let's go to these executives and spend time with them and figure out the roadmap, and more, let's have a growth PM, maybe who even has a gaming or social media background, who can think about how do we create features and change aspects of the product to create more engagement. And so I think what we're seeing is sort of a company today that's being built around bottom-up software, their first 30 hires, I think, actually looks pretty different. The composition of the business looks very different than a traditional SaaS company with the first 30 hires.
What kinds of companies, to zoom out for a sec, would have made sense as top-down investments, but are unlikely to be bottoms-up, or vice versa? Or types of companies, or maybe types of subsectors or spaces that made more sense in the previous era, or make sense now that didn't make sense? I'm just trying to get a better sense for, what do I invest differently in a bottoms-up world than a top-down world? That's
a great question. Let me lead off by saying I think one easy way to think about it is just to invert the trend that we're seeing, which is there are certainly spaces where individual users are not necessarily today seeing more buying power, purchasing authority. That could be a variety of fields. For example, perhaps the data they're working with is deeply sensitive. They're in a highly regulated industry. Perhaps worker turnover is very high, and therefore you don't get a lot of stickiness in product usage in that job. Any role where there isn't a lot of individuals to sell to who have budget authority or have the ability to take out a credit card and expense $50 a month is probably it's probably a difficult category to build a bottom-up business in.
Yeah, I think there's certain categories where, unless the whole company adopts, it doesn't provide much value. And that's sort of a simple way to think about it, where, in a classic bottoms-up business, one person can get value, 10 people get more than 10x value. That's the ideal use case, where even if I have a collection of 50 individuals all working in their own silos, all using my software, that's great. But to the extent that one person in one department turns into 10 people in one department, then those 10 people are going to get some kind of compounding effect. That's ideally what you look for. But there are plenty of categories, and I think there will continue to be, where the level of change and adoption needs to be more, function-wide or enterprise-wide, where it's going to continue to be a top-down example. We have a killer company called Clary. We invested, in the early days pre-revenue, and what they do is they essentially pull in data. They're focused on sales forecasting, so they pull in data from Salesforce, from your email, from calendar, from Zendesk, from your website, all these signals to essentially use machine learning to predict which accounts are going to close and which ones are not. And then that data is used by sales management to try and prioritize, okay, which accounts do we think we're going to close that the system is telling us, these aren't going to close. These ones are not on track. And here's why, so that they can dig in and really triage where they spend their time to try and bring the dollars in. And what they've done is they've taken a system that today is also a corporate-wide system that takes place in spreadsheets. And the way the system works today at most fast-growing, companies is you get the data from Salesforce, you stick it into a BI type tool, you then spit it out in Excel. Then individual sales managers work with their salespeople to fill out Excel spreadsheets. Those spreadsheets get rolled back up, and now you have a forecast that is shared with the VP of sales, the CEO, and the CFO. So an incredibly cumbersome, complicated manual process that by its very nature is flawed and incorrect. And what ends up happening is sales leaders apply their own heuristics to try and compensate for that. The way I used to do it when I ran go-to-market Trilogy was, an account executive would say, okay, this account's going to close 90% in blood. And the first thing I would do at the end of the forecast call is I'd call our legal department and I'd say, have you gotten red lines yet? Okay, you haven't? No chance this account's closing, in the next 5 days. And Clary does that stuff automatically, because it sees through the email and exchange servers that you've had a meeting with the customer, that a contract's been exchanged, that pricing was approved. All that stuff can actually be automatically gleaned and processed. But the point being is the reason why Clary works is you have to adopt the whole system. Yep. If one person used Clary, it wouldn't be useful. The only reason the machine learning model works is it's collecting millions of signals and data points across the enterprise.
Where in top-down you didn't have to have everybody using it?
Well,
or they just mandate that everyone uses it?
Yeah, no, I think I think something like Clary has to be top-down. Like it just can't be a bottoms-up type of sale because of that. And so it's an incredibly successful company. It's fast-growing. It's creating a lot of value, but that's one where it's unlikely that a bottoms-up player will come in and disrupt that space. I think where bottoms-up is most interesting, I think there are really two categories where bottoms-up are interesting. I think one is where the incumbent is entrenched, not well-liked, but like the example I used with Siebel and Salesforce, the company is just not willing basically burn that investment and start over. And so the only way you can to displace that is to nibble at the bottom and sort of work your way up and disrupt from below. And so I think that, Salesforce to Siebel is the classic case study in that SolarWinds, our company in network management versus HP and Computer Associates, these big IBM top-down solutions is another classic example of that. Zendesk vis-a-vis the remedies and the support.com of the world is another example. I think that's one category. But I think the more interesting category of the examples Kevin gave, where this use case, there is no functional top-down equivalent. There is no, like the Reich example that I shared earlier, there's no one to sell top-down to, and the only way this category exists is because it's bottoms up. Same thing with something like Slack, where there's nobody at a company who's in charge of communications. There's no owner of that. And so the only way this happens, is some kind of bottoms up, type approach.
And do you think, let me just add a use case where I think we're seeing it emerge as a potential place where bottom up could be interesting, which is in markets with extremely high fragmentation, where an outbound sales model would be difficult to scale. And I think one of the areas we're seeing, founders spend time in is DAM, digital asset management, not crypto digital asset management, but like videos and files and searching and storing that. And, traditionally there hasn't been a lot of big companies in this space, partly because I think if you look at the structure of marketing agencies or you look at the structure of magazine publishers, I think something like 60% of all marketing agencies have fewer than 5 employees along the lines. And so that structure where a lot of the seats available, the user seats in the industry, there's a lot of people who work in these places, but most of these companies aren't going to be bigger than $1,000, $2,000 contracts. And so, it'd be very difficult to run an outbound sales organization, target all of them. You'd only be able to target the big players, and then you might be stuck with a small piece of them, with a relatively small addressable market. And I think the interesting question is, could you build a product that goes bottom up across all of these players and reduce a sort of more marketing-led transactional sale? And could you build a big company by actually addressing pieces of the market that traditionally couldn't be profitably sold to? That's sort of an interesting angle. And in fact, you could argue is where Slack has sort of ended up, which is, interestingly enough, in the organizations where top-down bundling, is really important to the CIO. Microsoft Teams seems like they tend to be winning some of those places. In organizations where people are paranoid about data security, and that drives decision making, Mattermost just carved out a bit of a place. And so what's interesting is it seems like Slack actually, where they're really dominant is you're a small company, you're finding your first communication tool. No one very few people that I know are going to Microsoft Teams. They're going to Slack. And so that's sort of been the space they've ended up carving out, which I think is actually an interesting phenomenon.
Well, I think to Kevin's point about fragmented or seats that are hard to sell into, I think another good example of this is SMB. And I think that's another place where you see an explosion of these kinds of opportunities. We have a great company called Homebase that sells to very, very small businesses. These are mom and pop owners of service companies, retailers, restaurants, et cetera. You walk down Howard Street in San Francisco, many of those establishments are Homebase customers. And when we met John and Rishi, the founders, they had almost no monetization, but they had tens of thousands of these businesses that were using their product, and they had no salespeople. It was completely bottoms up type of product that was adopted and used and loved by tens of thousands of businesses. And now today, there are hundreds of thousands of these businesses that are using the software, and it's all been done through a bottoms up and inbound model. And so what that's allowed them to do, interestingly enough, is as they've turned on monetization, their monetization pricing is disruptively low. So even when they do charge, they're able to charge a fraction of what the established players can charge, because we're not paying for this massive sales force that's doing outbound calling. That's incredibly expensive and very inefficient by definition. And so I think Kevin's point's a good one, where you have these fragmented, hard to reach communities and customer bases where the bottoms up helps. I mean, international is another good example of that, where a bottoms up product day one in many categories can be international. And I think about back my days of Trilogy when we set up our first office in Paris and then the UK. And back in those days, you had to hire an account executive from that country, because we were told that people in France won't buy from a German salesperson and people in Germany won't buy from a French salesperson. So pretty soon we had 15 different salespeople, and one in each of these countries, and it was incredibly expensive to try and scale that up. And then Japan required a joint venture, and all this complexity. With a bottoms up world, you eliminate all of that. That's what's so powerful.
By the way, another company we're in together, although I did it in angel capacity, is VoiceOps.
Oh yeah, totally.
That's an interesting company in the sales enablement space.
Yeah, no, it's a great company. Yeah. Definitely, we're super fired up about that. That's another trend actually we haven't touched on, of just a voice and SMS, and just how data there is sitting inside these CRMs. And you think about voice being still a dominant form of interaction between businesses and customers, and that data is typically not captured. And yes, salespeople are required to take notes after the call. You may have a call recording that no one listens to, but the fact that companies like VoiceOps are using AI to essentially extract the important metadata from those calls to essentially help drive customers through the sales process, coach salespeople on what to do and how to effectively sell, is incredibly powerful. And so I think we're going to see an explosion of opportunities now that the voice recognition technology has gotten good enough. And thankfully, Google and Amazon and Apple have their own reasons to invest a ton of R&D in making that great. And I think that is going to enable a lot of opportunities like VoiceOps and others.
What else should move to messaging?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. We've got sort of a front row seat at several companies in our portfolio, including Attentive, which is helping brands reach their customers through SMS, and Alio, which is helping employers reach potential recruits through SMS. And what we're seeing is just the engagement is off the charts. I mean, it's interesting because if we draw the analogy, in the crypto world, there have been a lot of people trying to build networks like earn.com where you basically pay to reach somebody. Yeah. And I think what's kind of interesting is that SMS is basically an existing network that does that, right? It forces you to pay, 10 cents per person, just per message. And so it holds some bar where there is inherently less noise in the channel, and it's now ubiquitous. We are in front of our phones and in front of our text messages, maybe an order of magnitude more often than we are in front of our desktops and in front of our email. And so I think certainly we are excited and interested to see where else messaging could be applied. I think there's two ways to think about that. Number one is what business processes, business software, business communications could be improved with SMS. But I also think there is my suspicion is, and I'm not a consumer investor, that there's a consumer side to that, which is if more and more of the volume of SMS you receive is from trusted brands and communities that you're a part of, then will there be new services that help you manage all of that? I mean, you still can't mark unread in SMS, and so to me, it seems there's a set of things that probably could be done around that. If you believe the long term is that more communication will be messaging rather than
totally
email.
Zooming back out, we were talking about growth a little bit earlier, but how do metrics change in a bottoms-up world in terms of what entrepreneurs should be thinking, but also in terms of how investors should be evaluating these businesses?
It's funny because I just got out of a meeting with a seed stage founder we're super psyched to back who's building a bottom-up business, basically enterprise search. And we were just talking about how to benchmark it because there's all this content about like how to evaluate sales and marketing efficiency if you're like a traditional SaaS company, like magic number and like what growth rate do you need to
CAC,
be
payback.
And sort of the 3-3-2-2 model of growing where you triple, double your ARR. But there's very little about how to think about what metrics to focus on. I think our view is, and what I just discussed about 45 minutes ago with them is, I think what matters ultimately is activation, retention, and distribution. More about sort of a more consumer model of thinking about it, which is, do we have our users seeing the value, building a habit, staying with us, and sharing the product with others? And the exact way you measure each of those things is going to depend widely based on the exact product you have. You might have a product where the user uses it once a week and they love it and they're willing to pay for it, and that's success. You might have a product where the user uses it 3 times a day and that's a disaster in terms of engagement. But I think every team needs to figure out what defines success there. And then I think what we're seeing is, if you can build a habit, if people find your product indispensable to their productivity, and if people are loving enough to share it with others, then the monetization opportunity is self-evident.
Yeah, and I think when you think about Series A SaaS, again, I think that using the traditional metrics, the most founders think about it as, I've got to get to $1 million of ARR. That's sort of become gospel, here in Silicon Valley, that, okay, I get to $1 million of ARR, then I'm going to go out and raise my Series A. I think, as Kevin points out, in this bottoms up world, it's totally different, and that, trying to shoot for $1 million of ARR may be counterproductive, actually, in terms of where you're investing your resources as a young startup. If you're spending too much time worrying about monetization, it may cause you to take shortcuts or make some bad decisions with regard to the product. And so certainly our coaching to seed stage founders that we're invested with is, don't worry about the monetization. The thing you want to worry about is, really two things. I think the engagement that Kevin talked about, and the spread of the product, but also that there is some dollar amount you can put on the value they're getting. And I think the dollar amount on the value they're getting, is going to be part intuition at that early stage. But it also does drive, how many users, you need to get to sort of a meaningful, size company. But worry less about actually necessarily hitting that $1 million of ARR. And so, having some evidence that people are willing to pay for it, and it's the moment you ask someone to pay, they don't go away. They're still retained, I think, is useful. But hitting certain thresholds, I think, is a lot less important, than it was a few years ago.
You mentioned you're excited about startups that are selling to SMBs. How do you advise more broadly what frameworks entrepreneurs should be thinking about in terms of picking the first customer segment and then maybe, pricing against it? What is all SMBs or go enterprise or startups or?
Well, I guess it depends on where they're starting from. I mean, I think we talked a little bit about how to think about
even Voice House, for example, at the beginning, they were like, who's our first customer? How do we think about that?
Yeah. We talked a little bit earlier about some of the traits of a particular market opportunity that might make it more attractive to pursue in a top-down manner versus a bottom-up manner. And certainly, I think in a top-down world, you probably want to be relatively prescriptive. I think what we see is, in a top-down world where you're doing a lot of outreach, I just think it's important to be really thoughtful about the profiles of individuals you're reaching out to. And in your early sales pilot conversations, what we're seeing is experienced founders are being thoughtful about factors about each pilot, including, size of the customer, Who is the buyer? What is the problem they're trying to solve? And ultimately, we think what we're seeing is by the time of the Series A, founders should have a good sense of pattern matching across type of role, problem they're trying to solve, and like the general size of the organization. And frankly, it's hard to know day one. And I think what's more important is to have a hypothesis and to consistently spend the time and money and effort to go and validate that. I think with bottom up, it's a little bit trickier because you almost don't want to be too prescriptive. Part of the goal is that you're going to discover use cases you never thought about a priori. But it's probably worth thinking about, a set of people who have some common, use case problem they're trying to address. Dropbox, like there's some set of people who need file storage, who might need file storage more. And there's probably some objective where it's important to, at least test it with a representative set of users. This enterprise search company we work with, they thought about, we want a few hundred people across various different functional areas, various profiles of individual, like what their educational background is, size of the company they're in, geographic location, whether they know us as founders as friends or they don't know anything about the company at all. And that I think has given them useful feedback to iterate on kind of where the pockets of engagement they're seeing.
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on what's the wave you're riding. And if I think about a number of our scaled SaaS companies, Gainsight, Optimizely, Clary, they all started selling to startups. Now, why did they start selling to startups? Because startups represented the companies that were leading edge on the particular problem they were trying to solve. When you think about customer success, it was really the technology startups that were at the front end of the wave of thinking about customer success, investing in customer success, caring about customer success. And so those were the early Gainsight customers. But today, it's the big companies that realize now, we now need to go do that. Optimizely, you think about A/B testing and experimentation, the culture of experimentation. That was something that most large companies weren't thinking about. But the startups were the ones that were pushing the thinking, were the early adopters who realized that this idea of A/B testing should be not something you do, once a year, but should just be built into the culture of how you run your business and how you run your digital experience. And now it's become a mainstream, concept. Clary, again, we shared that example. And so I think for areas where you're riding a wave, where likely startups are going to be at the front end of the wave, that's a great place to start. Even though recognizing those early customers may be, $15,000, $20,000, $30,000, ASP transactions. And eventually, as you get to the bigger companies, you'll end up scaling that up to multi-million-dollar transactions. I think that's one model. I think second is, there are companies, HubSpot's a good example of it. Our company, Homebase, is a good example of it, where they've just said, look, we want to serve the SMB. We're great at it. That's where we want to focus. We think we can build a $10 billion company just focused on SMB. We don't want to veer from that. And so for us, SMB is not a, kind of a stepping stone to get to somewhere else. It is where we want to live and where we want to play. And so I think that's an entirely different approach. And I think both work very well. I think the companies where your initial early customers are enterprises or big companies, that oftentimes can be the most challenging because you run the risk that you build a product that's only useful to 2,000 companies, the very largest companies. And if those customers are your early adopters, it's very difficult to go from the top of the pyramid, the top 2,000 companies down. But it's much easier to say, okay, I've got something that works for a startup for customer success. Okay, now I've got something that works for a $100 million company that cares about customer success. Oh, now Cisco has embraced customer success. I'm going to add those features that are needed. So I think that migration from the startup to the enterprise is something that works quite well. Starting at the enterprise, I think, can be tricky.
Let's talk about indirect impact and what this means for, say, CIOs and CTOs, and then new market opportunities.
Yeah, I think clearly one area that has been very interesting is this idea of spend management. You live in a world that used to be top down and centralized. You centralized procurement departments, and they have these systems from Ariba and SAP to manage the spend. Any contract that gets signed has to go through procurement, where they have this highly vetted process to manage every single penny and every single dollar and every single negotiation. But now with this explosion of bottoms up, you have actually large purchases being done for AWS, for catering in your kitchens, for office supplies, for transportation, that are all happening bottoms up in an unmanaged way. And so as you think about the challenge that places on the CIO on managing all of this software, the challenges it puts on the finance organization, for managing where the spend is, and how do you enable the creativity and essentially the decentralization that you want to have. You want to create a culture where somebody at the front lines doing information work can buy the tools they need. They're not stuck waiting for some approval. But how do you balance that with the ability to have visibility, the ability to reconcile it against budgets, the ability to make sure that those vendor payments are managed in a seamless way? Kevin and I spent a lot of time in this category, along with our partners, Matt Harris and Kerry Goman, who lead our fintech practice. And that led us to, an investment in Airbase that we announced recently, that, we're delighted we're in with you guys, at Village Global. And, I think what was compelling to us about Airbase was, the fact that, Teja, one, incredible, product visionary, great product founder, but he really went and thought about how should this process look for a modern company. Rather than tweaking the existing process, let's reinvent the entire process from the ground up. And he took literally a first principles approach to this problem of saying, this is how companies are operating today. And by the way, if startups are operating this way today, this is how, Ford Motor Company is going to operate, over the next 5 to 10 years. The large companies are going to operate this way. And so how do we design a system that balances the decentralization required to get work done with the centralized visibility and spend management and vendor payments that you want to get the savings, as well as, streamline the budgeting and reconciliation. And that's essentially what he's built. There are other companies that are focused a little more on the CIO and helping the CIO track what software they have. A terrific company that we're not investors in, named Productive, that is, essentially helping the CIO track and understand which products are being adopted, which ones are being used, which ones are not being used, to allow them to manage their assets internally as an IT organization. So I think you're seeing, this first wave of startups that are helping modern companies manage the fact that everything's become bottoms up. So it's kind of funny. We spent the whole podcast, talking about bottoms up software, but this is now like the first order derivative companies that are now taking advantage, of this tailwind.
Yeah, and I think that one of the other things we think about that there are implications for is the kind of supply chain of building, selling, distributing bottom-up software. Basically, if you believe more and more software will be built this way, then what are the implications for services that will support these types of organizations? And one way to think about it would be infrastructure, right? Like there are open source frameworks and maybe companies build around them that allow companies to offer like real-time collaboration in their products. That sort of Google Docs, so you and I can edit at the same time experience. I think you're seeing an explosion in interest in tools to help product teams be more productive, build closer to the customer request. Product Board recently raised a big round is maybe an example of that. We have a company called Parlor, which helps product managers and customer-facing teams listen more closely to their user base. I think that we touched on internationalization earlier, and I think to the extent that you believe that these software tools look more like, consumer companies, I think one of the interesting things with consumer companies is consumer online brands are international from day one. And, consumerized business software, I think, is also international from day one. So should there be tools to help you day one be able to support users who want to use your product who are based in Russia or France or China? There's is sort of a whole tool chain that will get built that has this tailwind from the way that in which software is changing.
Yeah. Let's talk about, in the beginning of the podcast, you talked about robotics and you talked about supply chain. Maybe let's talk about the biggest places you guys are looking in those areas, or what's most interesting to you about those areas.
Yeah, we as I mentioned earlier, we had a good fortune, early in my career at Bain to meet a founder named Mick Mounts who had worked at Webvan and actually had worked in the distribution center at Webvan. And Webvan was kind of the Instacart predecessor that raised $1 billion and went under. And the reason they went under is that $100 bag of groceries actually cost $30 to pack. And when you think about that $100 bag of groceries, having a gross margin of $10 or $20, the math didn't work. And that really was the genesis of Kiva Systems. And, what was interesting about Mick, and I think, robotics has had a lot of funding, and unfortunately, they're having a lot of successes, and Kiva is, certainly one of the successes. And I think what's interesting about Kiva, and I think the insight that Mick had, was he looked at the problem and he said, there are parts of this problem that robots can solve today that don't require breakthrough R&D. And there are parts of this problem that robots probably can't do for 10 years or maybe 20 years. And the way he explained it to us back in 2004 was he said this idea that a robot can look at a shelf of items and grab something that might be a broom, it might be a resistor chip, it might be a t-shirt, it might be a bag of diapers, and know how to grab it, where to grab it, what the weight's going to be, and pick it up and put it into a box. He said that's a really hard problem. And in fact, here we are, 16 years later, and Amazon is funding, continues to fund robotic challenges around robotic picking. And Mick said, that's too hard to solve, so I'm going to have a human do the picking. But the part that a robot's great for is moving the goods around the warehouse. And he said in a typical warehouse at Webvan or at Amazon, the average fulfillment worker is spending 70 to 80% of their time walking to the shelf, and only 20% of the time actually picking, scanning, and packing. So that's really what led to the insight at Kiva, which is let's use the robots to do what robots do well, which is find the item and move it to the worker and then have the worker pick it. And by having the robots do the finding and having the inventory sit on mobile shelving as opposed to fixed shelving, you also essentially converted atoms into bits, where just like you today, I have no idea where my data is. It's not on my hard drive on my, on my desk or on my laptop. It's sitting somewhere in the cloud. I don't care as long as when I need that data, it shows up. And, companies like Amazon and others and Google have built all this great technology to cache what I need most, closest, so that I get that high performance stuff I use less often, maybe further away, maybe on cheaper storage. That's effectively what Kiva did, which is the stuff that's high frequency. The week before Easter, the Easter candy is sitting right near the pick workers. The day after Easter, the system intelligently would figure out, I can put that shelf all the way in the very back of the warehouse because no one's ordering Easter candy the day after Easter. And so that's the beauty of that system. And I think what distinguished Kiva was that really was an integrated software system where the robots were an enabler, but were not the heart and soul of the company. And, a more recent investment we've made that I think is a lot of parallels to Kiva is Ike. And, Ike is one of the pioneers in autonomous trucking. And, when we looked at the world of autonomy and we looked at point-to-point highway long-haul autonomy versus city driving, our view after, digging into the space and certainly informed a lot by our Kiva experience was city driving autonomy reminded us of trying to solve the problem of using robots to pick an item, from a shelf that you could, it's easy to solve the first 80% of use cases, but the next 20% of corner cases are impossible. And point-to-point highway driving, we concluded, as did the Ike team, that it was probably a couple orders of magnitude simpler and therefore more solvable in a time window that made sense. And what's interesting about Ike and the parallel to Kiva is they still rely on humans to take the truck from the highway to the warehouse. In many ways, that last mile is similar to the Kiva system of having the last pick be by a human and have the robots do the stuff in between. But going across the country on highways for days on end, where human drivers are limited by the number of hours they can work, limited by sleep, certainly challenges with boredom, being away from home. That actually is better suited, for robots. And there's, extreme shortage in this country for drivers, for those reasons. And so if you could create a hybrid system where the humans are doing the, portion from the highway to the warehouse and then use robots for that long haul piece, I think that's really powerful. And so I think we look at robotics investments and we really think about founders and companies that are taking more of a systems approach, where the hardware is, a necessary enabler, but is not sort of the thing unto itself that it's selling. And so I would say there are a lot of great founders we've met that are sort of taking product X that's a piece of hardware that's not automated and turning it into automated. We find those a lot less, interesting for those reasons.
How about supply chains and industrials?
Well, I think what's interesting about supply chain is that if you go back to the 90s, and probably most entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley couldn't answer this question, but if you interviewed folks in Silicon Valley and said, what was the most valuable technology company in the 1990s? My guess is probably no one could name it, but it was Dell Computer. And why was Dell the most valuable company in the 1990s? Because their innovation was a supply chain innovation. They figured out that if they could create a supply chain that was build to order, as opposed to actually building a bunch of SKUs and sticking it in the channel, that was better for the customer and it was actually more cost effective, where I as a consumer could go online, configure what I wanted, and have it shipped to me in a day or two versus having to buy whatever model was sitting in the channel. And that was their innovation, and actually led to this insane wave in the late 90s called re-engineering, and re-engineering the corporation. And this guy named Michael Hammer created that whole lingo. And C-suite executives would fly down to Austin to meet with Dell to understand their innovation. Now, if we fast forward to the last 20 years, probably among the one or two fastest appreciating companies in the history of humankind is Amazon. And if you look at Amazon, yes, it's an e-commerce company, but really their innovation, it's a supply chain company. I mean, their front end website has not changed in a decade, in 15 years maybe. I mean, you think about all the innovations in the early 2000s, one-click ordering, product recommendations. If you like this, you'll like that. There's been nothing actually on the front end of the website, but all the innovation has been the fact that I can get Amazon Prime. I can click on anything, get it in 2 days or in 1 day, and the fact they've now vertically integrated where they're now even doing the last mile delivery. I think that really shows the power of supply chain. And so I think what you're seeing now is companies in every industry that have any kind of physical product, that they have to move around, are realizing that this is the key to long-term success, that reinventing their supply chain is important. And when you think about the systems that have been built historically for managing supply chain, SAP and, Oracle and these systems from the 90s, the data fundamentally is not real time. It's latent data that is by definition wrong. And how do you convert that into a real-time system? And this is where, FourKites is really interesting, where that initial use case I mentioned was, okay, on-time arrival. Do I know if my truck is going to be there on time or not? But what's really powerful is we now actually have a real-time view of the supply chain, because we know at FourKites that this truck has left your main distribution center. Because we're integrated into your SAP system, we know you have this much inventory in that distribution center, but some subset of that inventory just left because it went on that truck. And we also know that you have a truck coming into that warehouse with this much inventory. So we now have a more accurate view of your inventory in your distribution center and at your customer than SAP does, because we have the actual real-time view. And so I think when you think about cloud and machine learning and all of these technologies, what better application than supply chain? Because here's the other thing about supply chain where cloud is really powerful. Coke is one of our customers, Coca-Cola at FourKites, and Walmart Canada is one of our customers, and Alcoa is one of our customers. Now, interestingly enough, Coca-Cola uses FourKites technology to see which trucks, are headed to Walmart and are they on time or not. Now Walmart says to us, hey, we're a customer of yours and we're using FourKites to think about our trucks going to our distribution centers, but we'd love to know if the Coke truck is showing up at our distribution center, if it's running late or not, because we have people in our DC waiting for that truck to unload it and pack it up. So if we know it's running 2 hours late, that'd be really useful for us. Now Alcoa is a supplier to Coke. And Coke says, hey, I'd love to know when the Alcoa truck's coming to my distribution center. So you think about this power of cloud, and now, a company like FourKites is in a position to really offer a cross-enterprise service. That would never happen in the world of on-prem, where you'd have to physically integrate Alcoa's on-prem system with Coca-Cola's on-prem system with Walmart's. Never going to happen. But in the world of cloud, it's now finally possible. And so I think, the combination of the fact that companies are realizing supply chain is the key to long-term success, and Dell in the 90s, Amazon in the more recent era have been bellwethers for that, combined with cloud and machine learning now making this, finally possible. I think we see that as super exciting. So we have a whole, array of companies in supply chain, a company called ShipBob that, is the leading provider of fulfillment services for, direct to consumer brands. We have a company called Vention, which, think of Vention as an industrial IKEA or Lego set that allows you to create these massive automation cells. And that's, by the way, another example of a bottoms-up company where I could be an engineer inside of a Tesla factory, and I'm constantly iterating our factory line. And I realized, this particular line could be automated if I had, an inspection robot sitting on, some kind of automation cell that goes in, 3 dimensions where I can inspect this particular part. That engineer can go online, go to Vention.io, design the system in a matter of, minutes, and click on a button and have a package arrive the next day with directions like you'd get at IKEA on how to assemble this $30,000 piece of equipment that normally would take 6 months to go make happen. And so we're super excited about our portfolio in supply chain and industrial automation, Ike and Vention, ShipBob, FourKites. But we think there's a lot more to do, and so it's an area we're continuing to spend quite a bit of time and energy.
Yeah, if I frame it maybe as one opportunity and 2 risks to think about. I mean, the opportunity, as Ajay said, is clearly that there's this behemoth. Amazon is a highly successful company that has raised the table stakes for supply chain capabilities. And so how can founders help various people throughout the supply chain, all the way down to the end raw material suppliers, all the way up to the retailers? How can we help them raise their game? And then I think the 2 risks that we often see in this space that are interesting to think about, one, some people pursue tech-enabled services. And what we aren't sure about, what we'd love to learn more about from founders is, does tech-enabled service truly provide technology leverage, or do you ultimately become a slightly better services company? I think the other big challenge in supply chain is you do have a lot of, very entrenched incumbents. And it's a sector of the economy where if you tend to go head on against the incumbent transportation management system, warehouse management system, et cetera. These are big opportunities, big software markets, and there's a lot of budget to be unlocked. But the reality is they often come with really long sell cycles with a lot of uncertainty. And so what are ways that sort of people are finding to have a higher velocity business where you're not relying on huge deals to grow the company?
Yeah. Let's close with a couple closing questions. One is, what are a couple of areas by which, or non-obvious areas that you are looking in terms of requests for startups, less obvious patterns that you find interesting? And if we're having this conversation 5 years from now, 10 years from now, how do you expect things to be different? Or what's one prediction you have in terms of how the fundamental structure of how business software is evolving might be different than it is today?
Look, in terms of companies we're excited to meet, Erik, you and us all know that the Valley these days is gaga for, low code, no code, product led, bottom up software, machine learning infrastructure. Look, we are excited about those topics as well. We want to meet those too. I think I think the stuff we're seeing where there's fewer people as focused on it. One is kind of the implications of a growing economy of, software that sells to the user. Airbase falls in this world, but also some we talked about the supply chain, infrastructure for building these products, tools for marketing and distributing these products. If community becomes so important, community management software. The second theme that we're seeing is, and that our partner Matt talks a lot about, is embedded fintech. So more and more tools own the customer relationship. And I saw this in our world of lending at Fundera, where you have companies like Square, which are in some ways business software companies selling a POS software, but now they have access to the customer relationship and proprietary customer data, and they are well positioned to make loans. Square Capital has done several $1 billion of lending in a very short period of time. And so we're interested in other ways to either enable financial services to be embedded as a developer tool, and we're also interested in novel ways in which financial services enables the unlocking of a particular market opportunity. You could argue that companies like Opendoor, Fair, they're truly offering a financial service, but that is creating supply and demand for a marketplace, for example. And then lastly, you and I touched on this earlier in the conversation, which is SMS is hot, where it's interesting to see kind of the engagement differences and what are the implications for other business software categories that could leverage this opportunity, and what are the implications for consumer products to help all of us manage this volume that's coming in the future. Speaking of the future,
take us home, Ajay.
Yeah, well, I mean, Kevin, come on, you stole my thunder here, but I do think that this idea that one of the implications of software being easier to build and this proliferation of companies and startups is that core application software in many ways is being commoditized. As you think about just the fact with AWS and others, the tools to build it are dramatically lower. And then just the sheer number of people who are founders today that are building things means, what used to be kind of a unique idea in a new application space now is feeling much more commodity-like. So what are the implications? And I think embedded fintech is one example. I think this idea that the way you make money as a software company over time, was, in the 90s, upfront license plus 20% maintenance. In the last 20 years, it's monthly or quarterly or yearly, SaaS fees. I think in the future, maybe actually you're not charging anything for the software, and we're going to make money on data. We're going to make money on fintech. We're going to make money on marketplace. And so we are seeing emerging companies, certainly many in the fintech world, but many that actually don't have any kind of fintech element where their monetization strategy is through some derivative effect of lots of people using their software. And so I think you're going to see a lot of interesting creative models. And I don't know if it'll end up being a standard approach like SaaS, but I think we're going to have to develop some new lingo, I think, for this next 10 years on a set of software companies that aren't on-prem license and maintenance. They aren't pure cloud SaaS, but there's some hybrid way to deliver, hybrid way that the customer gets value, and a hybrid way that, the software vendor gets paid. And I think I think you're starting to see the early companies innovate on that front. And I think in some ways it's incredibly disruptive. As I mentioned before, in the Salesforce example, they said, that 20% maintenance you're paying Siebel, that contract you bought 10 years ago, we'll just charge you for that 20%. Now you can say, that $2 million a year you're paying for that piece of application software, we'll actually charge you nothing for it. You don't have to pay us anything for that and get value out of it. And by the way, yes, we need to make money, but here are all these other ways that we're going to make money. And so I think you're going to see that as, an interesting new wave. And Matt, as Kevin said, talks a lot about it with payments and so forth. But I think there are, a whole array of ways that you can start monetizing this technology. So I'm super excited about it. Like I said, my first software company was in the late 80s, Trilogy in the 90s, SaaS for the last 20 years. I don't think we're done yet. There's definitely going to be a new model.
My guests today have been Ajay Agarwal and Kevin Zhang of Bain Capital Ventures. Ajay, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Erik. It was great.
Great conversation. Thanks so much.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.